Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is January 4th, 2011, and my guest is Bruce Caldwell of Duke University. He's the author of, among other books, Hayek's Challenge, and he's the general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek. Bruce, welcome to EconTalk.
Great to be here, Russ. Our
subject today is F.A. Hayek, an economist who comes up fairly often on this program, and he's having a very good run. Here we are in 2011, and this past year saw a rap video that John Popola and I created on Hayek's ideas that has over 2 million hits on YouTube. A love song to F.A. Hayek. I hadn't expected that, by Dorian Electra. It's in the last time I looked was in the tens of thousands of views. I don't know where it is lately, but it's been had a charming run of success. The Road to Serfdom hit number 1 on Amazon, thanks to an endorsement and discussion by Glenn Beck. So he's very relevant, and we're going to talk today about why. Our plan is to talk about his life, his ideas, and his work, particularly what someone might read who's just getting started. So let's begin with his life. Give us a brief sketch. Tell us about his life. Okay.
So Hayek is contemporaneous, basically, with the 20th century. He was born in 1899 and died in 1992. Indeed, this was one of the reasons that I was interested in him as a figure to study, because he was there over a period of time when economics really changed in many ways, and he participated in and also opposed some of those changes through the course of his life. So he's a good figure to study economics in the 20th century as well as himself. So, born in Vienna in 1899, he served during World War I. Following the war, he entered the University of Vienna. He was a student at Friedrich von Wieser. He got his degrees in the early 1920s. He had a number of distinguished classmates. Fritz Machlup and Gottfried Habeler are some that economists might know in particular. Oscar Morgenstern, one of the founders of game theory, was also a fellow student at the University of Vienna. One of his professors that I believe he took a course from, it's a little unclear from the record exactly whether the relationship in terms of coursework, but that he worked under was Ludwig von Mises. I worked with him in a temporary office. And after getting to know Mises a little bit, when he finished his second degree in 1923, he went off to the United States for a period of about 15 months. The most famous economist that he met there was Wesley Clair Mitchell, the father, or one of the fathers of American institutionalism, someone who was just about to become the president of the American Economic Association, and Hayek sat in on his class on types of economic theory.
Mitchell was a formative figure in the National Bureau of Economic Research and their collection of data.
Yes.
You call him an institutionalist, which covers a lot of ground, right? But what he is still considered by many to be worth understanding is his emphasis on the importance of data, which, of course, Hayek is going to spar with him a little bit over time.
Absolutely right. One of the interesting aspects of this whole story is that Hayek grew up in the Austrian tradition, which had as one of its opponents at the end of the century, the German Historical School. And the German Historical School had an older German Historical and younger German Historical School. The younger one was headed up by a guy named Gustav Schmoller, who said, well, what we need to do is gather statistics, and it's premature to try to have a theoretical understanding of social phenomena until we've actually gathered a sufficient amount of statistics, and then we can start perhaps some point in the future theorizing. So this was a school that the Austrians had sparred with, and after World War I was over, the German historical school, for a variety of reasons, ended up being fairly discredited. They were not able to be helpful during World War I. If you just say, well, we just have to gather statistics, but we can't really put them together in any way, in a meaningful way, or contribute to the war effort. This wasn't viewed as helpful. They had not anticipated or written anything about things like the hyperinflation. So they were more or less discredited. Hayek gets to the United States, and here's Wesley Clair Mitchell, who is perhaps, as I said, about to become the president of the American Economic Association. And he's saying what we need to do is collect statistics. He's saying the same sorts of things that Schmoller had been saying, although it must be said he was much more sophisticated about the way he intended to use the statistics to help experts manage an economy. Now, he wasn't a socialist by any means. Mitchell wasn't. But he was somebody who thought that science could be used to restructure society in better ways, and that it was the responsibility of people like him and those who would be helping with the National Bureau of Economic Research to do so. So Hayek was in this bizarre position of sitting in on this guy's class, and hearing him as kind of the avant-garde American economist spouting ideas that he, in his own experience, had felt had been many of them discredited in some ways.
Well, it's interesting because I took 2 classes on macroeconomics from Robert Lucas, and that's my only understanding of Wesley Clair Mitchell until I read Hayek's Challenge. Mm-hmm. And I learned from Lucas that Mitchell was a very important figure because he understood that you have to have stylized facts. You can't have all the data you need, but you have to know what's to be explained. Right. And that's what Lucas learned from Mitchell. And ironically, Lucas, of course, learned also from Hayek. So I think the issue here is data without theory is meaningless. It's sort of like information without a filter. Mm-hmm. If you search the web without Google, you're going to spend a lot of time searching. What makes Google useful is it filters. So you need some kind of theory. And I think the German school, the way I understand it from what you wrote, the German school didn't think you should have too much theory. Well, that's going to make it a lot harder.
Right. And I think that you've captured very well the difference between the two approaches. Although, from Hayek's Austrian viewpoint, he was going to see some of the similarities between the approaches as well. But I mean, they were also the German historical school, and they were basically conservative imperialists, and that was something that Mitchell was not at all. So I mean, there was lots of other dimensions that they differed as well.
Okay, so carry on. So he comes to the United States briefly, goes back then to Europe.
Back to Europe, sat in on the Mises's Privat Seminar, got married, is working in Vienna, and gets invited to the London School of Economics, and gives 4 lectures there, lectures that ultimately get this is in early 1931. These are published as Prices in Production. This leads to an invitation to come to the LSE as a visiting professor for a year, and this ultimately turns into a named chair. So he stays at the LSE then from 1932 through 1950. This is a very, very important period in his life. He starts out engaging in a big debate with John Maynard Keynes about their respective theories of the cycle. He ends up debating people like Frank Knight over capital theory. He has debates with a variety of colleagues at the LSE as well as others on the merits of socialist planning. This is when he starts writing his works on economics and knowledge. That's the name of an article that he published, but this begins his contributions to the knowledge problem. And by the end of the decade, he's working on a large project that ultimately results in the publication of a number of articles during the war, but most importantly, the road to serfdom in 1944.
Let's talk a little bit about 2 things that I'm very interested in. I hope listeners are as well. One of which came up in a recent podcast we did with Pete Betke on Mises. Mm-hmm. And I remarked on the fact that it seems interesting that, and a little strange, that Hayek is so famous and Mises less so for the socialist calculation debate. Partly, Pete suggested, partly because Mises was writing in German. And here was Hayek writing in English in this formative period in the 30s. but he was Mises's student, if not literally in the classroom in the seminar that you mentioned, and certainly as a mentor.
Absolutely.
When he worked for him at the Chamber of Commerce. What's your thoughts on the relative impact of Mises and Hayek on the calculation debate and the feasibility of socialism?
Yeah, it's strange. I actually would have thought that Mises would have been more associated with the critique of socialism. I guess in the American context, where The Road to Serfdom is kind of a very well-known work, that might explain that. But of course, I mean, Mises though was the person who pointed out the difficulty of getting rational production under a system in which the state owns the means of production, and that you don't have prices for factors of production. So that essential insight was there in his article back in 1920. Now, it was published in German, but it was reproduced in Hayek's Collectivist Economic Planning, his book of 1935, which is basically the book that initiated the English language socialist calculation debate. And Hayek had two pieces in the book, an introductory piece and a concluding piece that ended up being reproduced in his collection, Individualism and Economic Order. So he had those two pieces, but the middle part of the book was translations of articles, and Mises's seminal article was there as well. And I mean, the point of the book was Hayek saying, look, the British intelligentsia is very interested in debating the merits of socialism. This debate has already been had, and there's some important contributions that are in other languages that you're not aware of. So this is the point of publishing this book. So, I mean, I think if it, to the extent that Hayek might be better known, it would be because of something like the Road to Serfdom being so well known in the just in the popular mind. But I think to anyone who knows the debates, Mises' central role is unmistakable.
No doubt, but it is Hayek who spars with Lange. It's Hayek who spars with Morgenstern. It's to that the 30s, the middle 30s were certainly a time when Hayek was very active and visibly involved with his intellectual counterparts.
That's right, and all of that took place in the English language. So I mean, certainly among English speakers, that's right. But yeah, I mean, Mises was sparring with people in German publications as well. Yeah,
no, I don't mean to downplay Mises' contribution. I just think it's interesting how that played out. Let's talk a little bit about the business cycle argument and debate between Keynes and Hayek. I had a thought after reading your account of it, and I wanted to get your reaction. But first, let's lay out the issues. Hayek writes in 1931 in Prices and Production. The general theory comes out in 1936, Keynes's magnum opus. He had an earlier book, which I think was
Treatise on Money,
which was when
1930.
So Hayek writes a scathing critique of that, a scathing review, and there's a sort of historical puzzle as to why he was relatively silent about the general theory. And you could conclude, and I think many of us in the mainstream of the profession would conclude that, well, he lost. Keynes's theory, took the field, and Hayek, the world stopped paying attention to the Austrian business cycle theory. What's your take on that that history?
Okay, well, certainly the exchange that they had when Hayek first arrived in London was very significant for both of them. As you said, Hayek wrote a very strong two-part critical review of a treatise on money. Keynes responded to the first part of that two-part review in between the time when the first one came out in August and the next one came out in March of the next year. Somewhere in between, I think it was November, Keynes responds, and he defends his own approach to some extent, conceding some of Hayek's criticisms, but also attacks Hayek's own book. And both...
It's unusual, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was viewed as highly unusual, and indeed it made for some entertainment. Exactly. I mean, this is as good as it gets in academia, two people just going at it in the journals. And with colorful language. I mean, Keynes was one of these extraordinary writers who is just impossible not not to just read with great. He writes with such color and verve. So it's a good match to watch. So this was their initial encounter, and both of them had utilized the work of the Swedish economist Knut Wicksell, and Hayek, I think, had the better part of the initial encounter simply because Hayek read German. Wicksell had written in German. Wicksell had written 3 books in German. Hayek knew all of them, integrated aspects of them into his own work, whereas Keynes did not read German very well, said as much in his book, Our Treatise on Money, and did not incorporate all of the things that Wicksell had said into his own work. So for a variety of reasons, Keynes rethinks his approach. There's the whole story about the people at Cambridge who were offering him criticisms, the introduction of the multiplier and all these other ideas that end up being part of the Keynesian corpus. And he published his book in 1936, and it becomes quite famous. But at the same time, Hayek is also working on his own revisions of his work, starting as early as 1933-34. He said, well, this whole average period of production construct is something I'm not happy with that I took from von Beverk, and he's struggling. And if you take a look at Larry White's introduction to the pure theory of capital, you get some idea of the problems that Hayek was having in trying to put this book together. He has correspondence with Fritz Machlup where he says, look, Fritz Machlup says to him, Machlup's in the United States, says, when are you going to send these chapters? And Hayek says, they're almost ready. In the next letter from Hayek, I tore it all up, I'm starting over again. Or, I'm not going to do that section. And he just struggles and struggles, and finally, when he publishes his revised work that was supposed to be integrating capital theory into a monetary theory of the economy, it's the pure theory of capital. So he's done the capital theory part. He has a few chapters at the end of that book that speak to some of the monetary theory issues. But basically it's clear that he has not accomplished what he wanted to do. It comes out also in 1941, the world's at war. It's not going to get the kind of notice that Keynes's book did. Now, the full story of that is of the Keynesian ascendancy and the various elements that went into it is actually a very rich story that's probably we don't have time to go into, but it was a whole combination of things that ended up being able to explain that. But I mean, it was a fairly quick ascendancy, it must be said. But certainly by the time the war was over, Hayek has actually a famous recollection of Keynes where he said Keynes probably would not have been that comfortable with many of the things that go under the label of Keynesian economics. And the last time I saw him, he said he could turn around public. Keynes was so confident in his ability to turn around public opinion that he said, well, if these problems start to arise and inflation starts to raise its ugly head, I can turn public opinion around like that. And he clicks his fingers. And then, as Hayek said, and 6 weeks later he was dead. So there we have it. So that's a little bit of the Keynes-Hayek story. I don't know if it was responsive to all that you were asking.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I wanted you to talk about. What struck me in reading your account of it in Hayek's Challenge is a parallel with Schumpeter, who also struggled to produce his great work on business cycle theory, who before 1936 was considered, one of the world's great economists, mm-hmm. and Keynes eclipsed them both with a terribly flawed work that if I think either of them had written it, they wouldn't have been comfortable publishing it. They would have said, well, it needs more work. So there's a lot of factors, as you said, that went into the Keynesian ascendancy, but I think it's fascinating. The part of the reason I think for both Hayek and Schumpeter that their stars were eclipsed by Keynes was their acceptance that this problem was, quote, too hard. That it was, and I'm going to come back and talk about that because I think that really was Hayek's last word on business cycle theory. It wasn't so much, it's all about, monetary policy. Rather, it's too hard. And it's nothing to be ashamed of, that you can't build a complete model of capital theory.
I think the modeling of the economy part is what the complexity of the model that would need to be produced that could be anything close to being adequate was too complex. I think that's exactly right in terms of Hayek's.
And Lucas, I think you quote Lucas saying, a modern Nobel laureate, only shortly after Hayek in time, but much later in terms of the work on the business cycle theory, Lucas saying that, well, Hayek and others didn't have the tools, but I think it's not clear that we have the tools still. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that later. I wanted to ask you one other thing about, the other thing I think it's important to emphasize here is that Keynes's work in 1936 was not the first work on business cycle theory in economics, and his adherents often act like it was. There were a lot of people trying to understand why economies rose and fell. It was an old problem. Right.
David Laidler is one of the people, and also Bradley Bateman are two people who have articles that basically say all of these things that we think about the Keynesian revolution are wrong, and just goes down kind of he didn't invent macroeconomics. There was stuff going on beforehand. Some of these ideas that were claimed to be new were not, and right on down the list. Now, this is not taking anything away from Keynes as a public intellectual at all, or his importance in terms of impact on the 20th century.
Yeah, incredible.
But just in terms of the history, a lot of the this is what historians of economics do. They go back and they say, well, all of these popular images are false in these various ways. So
always good to learn.
Yeah, it puts bread on the table for us.
So the World War II comes, and again, as a macroeconomist, certainly Hayek and the Austrians are eclipsed by the ascendancy of Keynes. But at the end of World War II, Hayek writes his most influential book for the public at large, Road to Serfdom.
Right. And the story behind that is that he didn't plan to write The Road to Serfdom. What he planned to do was a much bigger work. I was always conceptualizing these huge projects. It's called the Abuse of Reason Project. It was supposed to be a 2-volume work. The first volume was tracing how the twin ideas of socialism and what he called scientism, that is to say, the sort of thing that he saw exhibited by Wesley Clare Mitchell, the idea that we can use science to reshape society in ways that would make it work more rationally. A very appealing idea, and he encountered it everywhere in the course of his life in the 20s and the 30s. It certainly was part and parcel of the logical positivism that he had encountered in Vienna in the 1920s. Indeed, the Mises seminar, the Mises Kreis, some of the members of that were also members of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism, so they were fully aware of this movement within the philosophy of science that basically provided the philosophical justifications for a worldview of science transforming society in progressive ways. He encounters it in the person of Wesley Clare Mitchell when he's in America in the 30s. He comes to the London School of Economics, which was founded by Fabian socialists in 1895. They were sufficiently confident of the truth of socialism that they didn't care about hiring someone like a Hayek because they figured, well, the truth will out. But this is an important scholar, so we're happy to have him on the faculty, and he encounters the ideas there. And when he looked at the historical evolution of these ideas, what he envisioned in this grand book was, well, it starts way back in the French Revolution days at the École Polytechnique, where the engineers of this école were also associating with people like Henri Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte, who end up being Comte being the father of kind of socialism and positivist ideas, and positivism, in fact, and traces the idea was to trace the spread of those ideas from France to Germany to Britain to the United States. In each place, it would be very different. It would take on certain national characteristics and characteristics according to the contingency of the period in which it entered.
Well, in the United States, it was the progressive movement, the idea that experts armed with the most modern tools could do better than we're doing by shaping and steering.
Right, and he also mentioned institutionalism in his outline. He doesn't mention progressivism itself, but this is exactly the idea.
Same social phenomenon. Yeah.
Right, exactly right.
Give us a little background before you go on positivism and logical positivism. What are they, and why are they important for this?
Right. So this would be the philosophical foundation about for many of these ideas. Logical positivism is a movement that began in Vienna in the 1920s. The Vienna Circle of logical positivism is the way it's often referred to. So these are philosophers saying, what is it that makes something really scientific? And they looked at a number of different sorts of problems. How do you distinguish a scientific statement from a non-scientific statement? Well, we do it by testing the statements. And what counts as a good test? Is the statement verifiable? Is it falsifiable? These are the sorts of questions that come up. What does it mean to make a scientific explanation? They have, for example, covering law models. I mean, these words to somebody who's not conversant with philosophy of science is probably not. Doesn't communicate much, but the general idea is that we want to be able to distinguish scientific thought from non-scientific thought.
So how did that contribute to scientific socialism? How did that idea, which seems fairly plausible and a good idea, that you should be able to test a theory, falsify a theory using data, which is what I associate with logical positivism, how did that get permuted into we need to run the country?
Right. So the social science expert in the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism was a guy named Otto Neurath. And Neurath was somebody who was very critical. He actually was in Bembewerk's seminar along with Ludwig von Mises. And in Mises's memoirs, he talks scathingly about Neurath as just, he had great respect for many of the other socialists that were debating with Bembewerk in the seminar, but he had no patience with Neurath. And Neurath was a guy who propounded a view called war economy. He said, well, what we should the capitalist system is a defective system. What we should do is have a moneyless system where everything is planned from the center. And we can do this. We have central planning of this sort during a war when the government takes over control of the productive apparatus, and we should just simply continue this after the war in the peacetime economy. We'd get rid of all of the defects of capitalism. We would produce goods that would be goods that met people's needs as opposed to according to profits. And he went down the list of reasons why this would be a successful system. This was actually...
What does that have to do with logical positivism? That's the part I'm confused about.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say this is what promoted or prompted basically Mises to react to Neurath and write about socialism and the problems of socialism. Well, what does it have to do directly? Neurath would be critical of, and this was also true of Mitchell, by the way, of standard economics because it made reference to things like subjective value. Well, subjective value is something that's in somebody's mind, and it causes them to act. Well, if you're scientific, you want to endorse, instead of that sort of psychology, behaviorism, where you don't make reference to any kind of subjective values. What you do is make reference to observable states. So the philosophical position of logical positivism emphasizes testing and making reference to observable phenomena, and that same sort of approach within the interpretation was that same sort of approach within the social sciences would be to get rid of all of this kind of theory that all the kind of theory that made reference to things like subjective values, which is basically what marginalism, neoclassical marginalism does.
Sure. Okay, so I got that now. Let's go back. So back to the Abuse of Reason project.
Mm-hmm. So that was going to be the first volume. The second volume was to say what are the consequences in the 20th century, and that would be based on an article that Hayek had written in the late 30s called Freedom in the Economic System. That part 2 ends up being The Road to Serfdom. He ends up not finishing part 1 about the spread of these ideas from country to country. He did a little bit on France, and he has an article on scientism and the Study of Society, but he doesn't finish that big first volume. And the second volume, about 1941, 42, he says in a letter to Machlup, I'm really actually he says to Machlup he's changed his mind. He's going to do the second volume as a short, more popular piece, and he explains it why in a letter to Jacob Viner, another an American economist, saying, I'm not so worried about the outcome of the war. I'm a little bit more worried now about the outcome of the peace.
Yeah.
And what things are going to look like here, because he was hearing the same sorts of arguments. We should continue planning after World War II of the sort of planning that we've got here during the war period. The same sort of arguments that had been made in Vienna by people like Neurath were being made by British socialists like Harold Lasky in Labour Party meetings and in popular pamphlets. So he was afraid of what was going to happen after World War II was over.
And, of course, there was a great deal of romance about the economic success of the Soviet Union that turned out to be quite untrue, but at the time was seen as a great goal for the West. That
pretty much went away with the show trials and the pact with Hitler. I mean, the bloom was off the rose with the Soviets. That certainly in the earlier 30s, that was true. It was less easy to have any kind of sympathy with the Soviets, except for the fact that they were allies against Hitler.
Yeah.
During the war.
Okay, so he writes The Road to Serfdom in 1940. It comes out in 1944 as part of this project. Right. 1947, we have the Mont Pelerin Society.
Right.
And he leaves LSE, I think, in 1950.
Yes. And
where does he go from there?
He goes from there to, for a semester he's at the University of Arkansas.
Really?
Because they had very lax divorce laws in that state. So that was one reason why he spent a little time there.
That would make a good movie. I'd like to see that. Hayek
right
in
along
Arkansas.
There with love story for Friedrich Hayek.
Yeah, there you go. So go ahead. So
he goes on to the University of Chicago, where he's on the Committee for Social Thought.
It's not in the economics department.
Not in the economics department. No. That's another one of those juicy stories that we wish we had more information about exactly why the economics department declined to invite him when it was first being proposed in, say, 48 or so. And there's all sorts of explanations that have been proffered. So some of them are that they didn't like being asked by somebody from outside to hire this guy because he was getting outside funding. That actually sounds very plausible to me. Others say, it was because of the type of economics he was doing, and particularly given the Coles Commission was at that time at Chicago. They're basically the group of econometricians. Obviously, they were not going to be as sympathetic to Hayek's work because Hayek was one of these people who didn't have much faith in econometrics at the time. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is the road to serfdom had discredited him. I don't think that's true. Friedman himself had said he didn't think that played a role. But there's been all sorts of conjectures about why. But
because it was popular, not because they disagreed with it, but because it was too popular work, right?
Well, it was the road to serfdom was viewed as a reactionary work at the time it was published. It's one of the ways in which you can really measure how the world has changed. I had a great conversation with the historian of economics, Mark Blogg, when I was editing The Road to Serfdom, and I said, I'm doing this work for the Hayek Collected Works, and it's fascinating. He said, "Oh God, I read that book, and it was garbage. It was just so reactionary." And I said, "Well, you ought to try reading it now and see what you think." And he came back to me and said, "Geez, you're right. I mean, if you read it in that particular period, where everybody who's a member of the intelligentsia says we don't know exactly what system we want to put into place, but it's probably going to be some sort of mixed system." and you have Hayek saying, "Well, this is potentially the road to serfdom." Certainly, the way he was read was that if you do this, you're going to be like the Nazis. People who have these kinds of feelings are going to end up setting up a situation in which the jackboots are going to be on the ground in Britain. And that was I contest some of the specific readings that people have made about what Hayek's intent was in The Road to Serfdom, but that was the popular image of it. Mm-hmm. And if you go in reading it with that popular image, well, a lot of people didn't even read it. They just knew it was going to be something that they disagreed with. You see a lot of that too. Sorry, kind of got off on a tangent there.
No, that's good. Keep going. So he comes to Chicago to the Committee on Social Thought, which is an interdisciplinary department at Chicago, which has a few of them, and that's one of them. Yep. And he's there for how long?
Till 1962, and the major things that were published while he was there were early his book on psychology, The Sensory Order, published in 1952, and then his big book that is on kind of political theory, political philosophy, and history, The Constitution of Liberty. Constitution of Liberty, one way to think of it is some people who knew Hayek as a good scholar and read The Road to Serfdom more sympathetically, like, as it turns out, John Maynard Keynes, who was quite complimentary about The Road to Serfdom in a letter to Hayek, said, but really, the real question is, how much planning by the state do we allow? You say there's good planning for a competitive order, and bad planning. How do we distinguish among these? What kind of criteria could we use to distinguish among them? How do we know the good stuff from the bad stuff? You've offered a good criticism of socialism, but we need to know more about what your vision of a good society is. And the Constitution of Liberty, in some sense, is a way of responding to that. Not a direct response, but it's certainly not a blueprint, but it lays out the principles of a free society in a way that I think is quite compelling.
And then where does he go? 16.
Well, and from there, in 1962, he leaves Chicago, goes to the University of Freiburg, stays there through most of the 60s. He spends about 5 years in Salzburg, then goes back to Freiburg. In 74 is when he gets the Nobel Prize. This is jointly with a Swedish economist named Gunnar Myrdal.
A Swedish sociologist, right? Really? Sort of an economist.
He wrote about monetary equilibrium. He had a book on monetary equilibrium published in the 1930s at the same time that Hayek was writing on monetary economics. So the prize itself actually mentions that both of them made important contributions to economic theory early in their career, and then later in their career that they branched out and looked at other areas. So it's basically putting them in the same kind of camp as economists who then made broader contributions. And neither one of them actually turns out were particularly happy about the fact that they had the other one as a co-recipient.
Myrdal was a socialist. Correct.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so he wins the Nobel Prize, and where is he at that point?
Hayek is. Do you mean Hayek?
Yeah.
At that point, he would have either been at the end of his time in Salzburg or just moved back to Freiburg.
Okay, and then.
But in terms of his intellectual life, he in the mid '60s he started working a lot on individual articles on ideas about complex phenomena, but also on his final great work in political philosophy, law, legislation, and liberty, which was published in 3 volumes in 73, 76, and 78, I think. So he was in the midst of putting that out. And then at the very end of the 70s, he has an idea of a grand debate between the socialists and liberals, classical liberals. And he tries to put this together unsuccessfully, but it is the impetus for his absolute final work, The Fatal Conceit, which ends up being published in 1988. You mentioned I'm the general editor of the Hayek Collected Works. This was the first volume in the Hayek Collected Works. His last book was published as the first volume, and it was edited by a guy named W. Bartley III, Bill Bartley, who was a philosopher who studied under Popper, and was to have been Popper's biographer as well as Hayek's biographer. Had lots of interviews with Hayek that have appeared in various places. They're quite rich. and was also going to be the editor of the collected works, but then he ends up dying actually before Hayek does. He dies in 1991. Hayek died in 1992. So that's there was another editor, Stephen Kresge was the second editor of the collected works, and then I took over from Kresge in the early 2000s.
And so when Law, Legislation, and Liberty comes out, he's an old man. He's in his late 70s by the time the last volume comes out.
Right.
The Fatal Conceit comes out when he's 89.
Yeah.
And there is, of course, for Hayek fans out there, it's well known that there's some dispute about how much of that book is Hayek and how much is Bartley.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned before we started our talk that you had spent some time in the Hayek archives, and one of the things that you will find out there are about a gazillion little postcards or 3x5 cards.
Yeah, index cards. I looked at
index cards, that's right. That he would write down his thoughts on and then organize them whenever he was writing anything. Well, this works well if you're Hayek working from these things, but when you've got, basically by 1985, his health really deteriorated. He didn't really even travel for the next 7 years until he died. But even before that, you can see this a little bit in the Charlotte Cubitt, his secretary's memoirs about his mental capacity kind of weakening even in the early 80s, and in her recounting, he would hand her things and ask her to kind of sharpen up the English. She was a person who was his secretary, but she was somebody who was a native English speaker, so she would do it, and then he'd go back and forth between the two of them, and then Bartley was getting involved in terms of trying to organize these file cards as well. And you can tell from the book itself, it doesn't have any footnotes. It has these little indented parts that I presume were things that were taken off these cards. So it's just very hard, and there are elements of the book that anyone who knows Bartley's work are very Bartleyan. Talking the discussion of evolutionary ethics, which appears at the end of one of the chapters, is pure Bartley. So there is certainly debate about how much of this should be taken as an important piece of Hayek's, or just because of its mixed the fact that so many different people contributed to it.
I want to say two things about it, and then I want to go back and we'll start talking about Hayek's ideas. But one is, to me, it's the most readable of Hayek's books, which is not, which is consistent with having it being either highly edited or worse, written by someone else. And other than those passages which you refer to, which are very Bartley-esque in intellectual tone, it's certainly true intellectually to Hayek's work. So it's not a betrayal. There's nothing in it that seems to contradict things that, to my eye, that Hayek had written before. I just find it to be a remarkably provocative, you could even call it a restatement of many ideas Hayek had written. So whether he literally wrote it or whether you could view it as an overview of some of his ideas, I find it very rich.
Yes, I mean, those who are familiar with Hayek's work will see all sorts of elements in it that have appeared in his earlier works, and as you say, expressed in clear prose. If you take the epilogue to Law, Legislation, and Liberty, whole elements of that are clearly there in The Fatal Conceit, for example. And there are extensions that would build on that, where he starts to refer to talking about cultural evolution and talking to more recent work that may have appeared that would help support some of the ideas that he had about that. So I'm with you on that. The question is, to what extent did he himself, in fact, endorse the new ideas that are there in The Fatal Conceit? I think that's the only question. It's not so much that he's reversing himself anywhere. It's that how important are these ideas that hadn't appeared in his earlier work to his belief system.
And just two other comments. One is, at the suggestion of a friend, I tried to read Bartley's work. I think it's called Return to Commitment. Is that the name of it? It's very
retreat to commitment.
Retreat to commitment, which is a very Hayekian, has a very Hayekian thesis about the abuse of reason. And I found it very difficult going. So it's not like Bartley was a lucid, most lucid of phrase makers. So that's one comment. Second comment I'll make, which is that the Fatal Conceit has two of my favorite Hayek quotes. One about the micro and macro cosmos, which I think I found a version of in the note cards. It's not literally word for word, but the other, of course, and that's about the dangers of taking socialism out, the love of family into the larger community. That socialism, the idea of socialism, is so deeply appealing to us because we have this love of family. And we should treat everyone like family, and he calls that the road to tyranny. He calls that, says that will lead to tyranny, and similarly doesn't want to import the model of prices into the family, and that this schizophrenia is the what we have to deal with as humans. I love that quote. But the other quote, of course, is the curious task of economics is to illustrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. Yep. That quote I couldn't find in the note cards. There are hundreds, thousands. There's a lot of them that are there in the archive. So I can't say I looked at every one of them. But again, that's not the most stylistically elegant quote. It's very Hayekian in structure. So
there we go.
I'm hopeful that it's his. I like to think it's his. Anyway, one comment on his life before we turn to his ideas I want you to comment on is his winning of the Nobel Prize. He must have been in many ways a very lonely man, at least intellectually. You've given in this brief sketch so many cases where he was viewed as a reactionary, he was debating with so-and-so, he was aligned against the intelligentsia. All the intellectual circles that he swam in, he wasn't in the one place that might have embraced him intellectually, philosophically, might have been the economics department at Chicago, at least in the 60s or 70s. It's not when he was there. He wasn't even in the economics department. Winning the Nobel Prize must have been quite satisfying.
I think it was.
Talk about that.
Well, indeed, in his interviews, he mentions that he actually felt that he was depressed in parts of the 1960s, and this had physical aspects to it. But he said, I think winning the Nobel Prize, I believe this is true, that he said in an interview that this kind of made things better.
Kind of made up for it.
That he felt better. I think probably equally important, though, is that he was aware of the rebirth of interest in Austrian economics that was starting to take place in the 1970s. And I was at NYU from 1981 to 1982. Ludwig Lockman would come to NYU every spring semester. I would spend every Friday morning for a couple of hours in his office talking with him. It was fascinating, very rich intellectual environment. There was lots of interesting people who were participating in the NYU seminars. And then there were these other things that were taking place in the summer, various sorts of summer schools. So he was aware of this. He was in Menlo Park for some of these periods, visiting at the Hoover. And he, I think that really made him feel like perhaps things were turning around. And this was important because a lot of the 70s was fairly depressing in terms of economics. Late 60s and 70s were quite depressing for him.
Keynes was continuing to be triumphant. His ideas were continuing to be triumphant, and the economy in the 60s was doing great. But the 70s saw this much darker turn, and it must have been pretty unpleasant.
Right, and one thing that I didn't mention was the publication of denationalization of money in the 70s as well. When he really is a time that he's returning to issues of monetary economics and talking about competitive issue of currency as a reaction to the stagflation of the 1970s. So,
which is consistent with his earlier work about the central bank's role in the business cycle. And
this part is a little bit tricky because he actually wrote different things at different periods of time in his life about monetary arrangements. You see different things from the 30s to the 50s to the 70s. Ludwig Lockman always had a delightful man. When we would talk about certain issues, I'd say, well, what do you think Hayek thought about this? And he'd say, which Hayek? So the different points in time, Hayek had different ideas. But anyway.
Let's talk about we've touched on many of them already, but let's talk about which of his many ideas are still important and relevant today and certainly part of his legacy.
Sure. Well, something that has been getting lots of attention in the recent downturn is Austrian business cycle theory. I think there are certain elements of it that are still quite interesting anyway to consider given the recent events. The whole idea that downturns take place when interest rates, the market rate of interest is held below the natural rate would be the way somebody in a Vixelian framework would put it, but basically long periods of low interest rates end up affecting the structure of production in ways that are not sustainable. You get too many, you get a misallocation of capital goods is the way it was in his model. If you take a look at the American and other countries' housing glut, this would be a very good portrait of the sort of idea that he had in mind. Certainly, the idea that you can somehow stimulate your way out of these sorts of problems was not something. This is a controversial point, and this is something where you would need to have Larry White on your program.
We have. We've talked about this. What his view was, it's complex. It
is complex. So maybe I'll just refer your listeners right now to your podcast with Larry White to go into the details of.
We'll put a link up to that. But what I wanted to mention and I'll let you comment on is that while he may have gone back and forth on his own position on what can be done in a proactive way,
right.
He doesn't seem to have ever endorsed the Keynesian aggregate demand stimulus story,
right.
And in his Nobel Prize lecture explicitly mentions the challenges of solving unemployment by spending money in any permanent way.
Just dealing with aggregates. I mean, he distrusted the whole notion of aggregates, and you can see this back in his writings even in the 1920s, before the Great Depression came along. That this is the idea that you can manipulate something as complex as an economy by looking at aggregate statistics, which actually in and of themselves are constructions of a person's mind, is something that he rejected throughout. So I think that's exactly right. And of course, the Keynesian program depended crucially on this and stimulated the collection of these aggregate statistics that were supposed to be used by policymakers to fine-tune the economy. So that's right.
So we have his contribution to business cycle theory and his skepticism about Keynesianism, for sure.
Sure. If we go further from there, as I said in the kind of overview of his life, in his debates in the 1930s, I think he came up with additional arguments about the limitations of socialism. Some of these were building on Mises's arguments. So if we recall, Mises said, well, when you've got state ownership of the means of production, which is what socialism is, you don't have prices for factors of production. If you don't have prices for factors of production, firms can't make rational decisions about what input mixes they need to make. And when you multiply the millions of firms in the economy and the sorts of decisions that each of them has to make and their interdependence, you've got real problems. Now, a response to this by someone named Oscar Lange, who we mentioned, a market socialist, said, "Well, wait a second. Yeah, we ought to put a bust of this was one of his famous lines. We ought to put a bust of von Mises in the central hall of the Central Planning Ministry for pointing out the importance of prices, but we don't need to worry about getting rid of socialism because we can simply adjust prices up and down. If we see an oversupply of goods, we will adjust prices. We see an undersupply of goods, we'll adjust price in the other direction. And we can just simply make these adjustments and just duplicate the workings of the economy." And this was precisely where Hayek came into the into the debate and said, well, this is your image of what we're able to do is unrealistic. And I think the best statement, although this is not directly responsive so much to Lange, of his idea is contained in the use of knowledge in society.
Yep.
So I know later you're going to ask me which things people should read. That would be the first one that they should read. And in it he paints a picture of how easy it would be. All of these allocation problems would be easy if we had full information. If given tastes and preferences, given incomes, given this says, and this is what our models often say we have. Okay, the kinds of theoretical models that we use say, okay, given this, given that, here's the equilibrium. He says, well, the whole point in the world is that in fact we don't have this knowledge. That the way the world is actually configured is knowledge is dispersed. So different people have different bits of knowledge. And some of their knowledge is inconsistent with other people's knowledge. Some people think it's going to be a very hot summer, so they're going to be producing suntan lotion. Other people anticipate a cold summer, so they'll be producing umbrellas. Some of them are going to be wrong. How do all these decisions ever get meshed? On top of it, and this is stuff that he adds later, this local knowledge of time and place, some of it is tacit, and this was reflecting the ideas of Polanyi later. Knowledge that I have been working in this particular market for 20 years. I know these market signs. I might not be able to explicate to somebody else why, but I have enough knowledge of these markets to make these particular decisions. So this is what all these individuals with their little bits of knowledge are making these decisions. That's the first half of the story. The second half of the story is, well, what do they base it on? They see all these prices that are out there in the world, in their little corner of the world that they're responding to, but every one of those people's actions feeds into those prices. Somebody's buying more, somebody's buying less. All of that feeds into the prices that everybody else sees. And this is an ongoing, complex process. And this is the marvel, as he put it in that article, of the price mechanism. That it is, on the one hand, something that we look at this array of prices to make our decisions, but then all of our decisions get reflected in this array of prices. It's constantly changing. And so he says, basically, you can understand then his response to Lange would be, well,
good luck, buddy.
Good luck, buddy.
The biggest computer in the world isn't going to help you solve that problem.
Well, later people have said, well, why? Supercomputers can do this now. Maybe we can do it. And I think that the answer to that is, show me.
Yeah.
Show me in a township where that could happen. No less the world economy or a national economy.
And that really brings us to the other idea that you and I talked about before we started this interview, which is the idea of emergent order, this idea that there are things that are the product of human action but not human design, and that the price system, which is and Hayek struggled with this just like we all do, that once you put the word system in there, you start to suggest, well, someone must have created the system, but that it's not created by any one person. It's instead the result of all of our actions interacting together, that phenomenon is the central, understanding that is the central problem of social science.
Well, I think that certainly hits the nail exactly on the head. And so other examples of this are something like the formation of money, and Adam Smith and Carl Menger both talked about how money emerges in order to, not because somebody invents it, but because it enables people to solve problems. So if I want scotch and I produce running shoes and you're the scotch producer, but you want a table, I have to take my running shoes to somebody who produces a table. I got this three-way trade problem. Money allows us
actually the consumer of the scotch, but I just want to say for the record. Not the
well,
producer,
you see, now this is an even worse case where both of us are consumers of scotch. But you end up getting this. You end up by having the emergence of money, specialization, trade is enhanced, division of labor is enhanced. You get these remarkable results that redound to everyone's benefit, but it's not like anyone went out and invented it. So unintended consequences consequences of human action, but not of human design. So market prices are a similar phenomenon. The language is often pointed at as one of these social institutions that...
Which you write Menger used as an example.
I believe that's right.
I first encountered it in Thomas Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions, which is a Hayekian book, but it goes back to at least Menger.
Yeah. Well, and Hayek was often remarking on Darwinians before Darwin, too, in terms of some of these ideas that end up being in social phenomena before they entered into the writings of natural scientists. So, this is a central idea in his work. Steve Horowitz has mentioned how his writings about the capital structure reflect the same sort of hierarchical structure that is not, it can be changed, but it can't be changed quickly, and it's all interconnected. Certainly, Hayek's work on the sensory order, where he describes the working of human consciousness, where if you look around the room, you see chairs and rugs and pictures on the wall, but actually this is the product of a gazillion neuronal firings in a hugely hierarchical system that end up producing consciousness as we know it. Certainly the synapses are not planning to produce consciousness, but it does. So he sees this sort of complex self-organizing systems in natural phenomena as well as social phenomena, and that certainly became a hugely important theme in his later work, and something that, for example, people who are working at Santa Fe on complex social orders, when they read Hayek, I'm sure they just say, this is the same sort of ideas that we're getting at.
So we have the business cycle theory, the threat of, the infeasibility, the impracticality of socialism. Right. Tied to that, we have the idea that there are these emergent orders that are undesigned but yet productive and crucial to civilization, that are steered unintendedly by, it's a horrible sentence, but by prices and other social constructs. Anything else you want to emphasize of his ideas? Well,
sure. I think a central part of Hayek's mission was to reconstruct liberalism for the 20th century. So he, like many people, Jacob Viner, Rupke, Keynes, rejected pure laissez-faire. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that they believe that there should, and if you asked each of them, they might come up with different sets of institutions, but each of them believe that a market system works well if it's embedded within a set of other social institutions. And these are things like a democratic polity, well-defined and protected system of property rights, where the property rights are exchangeable, stable monetary arrangements, operating under the rule of law, where everyone is equal under the law, where there's a protected private sphere of interaction, where you justify government coercion only if it is used to end coercion of people by other people. That's the direct reason for government. You give the monopoly of coercion to the government so that it can try to do good in terms of minimizing other sorts of coercion. So he came up with ideas about the sets, in very general terms, about the sets of institutions that need to accompany a market for markets to work well. And this is also where he becomes a controversial figure among some in the Austrian camp, because he will remain nameless, but as a close friend of mine in the Austrian camp put it about the Constitution of Liberty, he loved Hayek's defense of liberty in the first two-thirds of the book, and then he gave it all away in the last third of the book. So he actually did not add on to his... He would allow for a lot more government intervention on grounds that he said, I might disagree with it personally, but it would be permitted under a system in terms of the way I'm defining it within this book, and not be inconsistent with liberty. And for somebody for whom, for example, taxation is a form of coercion.
He wasn't much of an anarcho-capitalist.
He was not an anarcho-capitalist, precisely right.
But as he wrote, he was not a conservative either. He was somewhere in between. His own kind of classical liberal, his own kind of libertarian.
Right, and he didn't like the word libertarian either, apparently. Yeah, old Whig, that was the phrase he liked to use, which of course just makes everybody...
Yeah, that ain't coming back. That is not going to make it into the general lexicon.
I don't think so.
Let me propose one other idea, which is certainly consistent with what we've talked about, but that I view as an important contribution of Hayek. We talked about the idea of scientism, which is this idea that it's dangerous to use the tools of science for purposes that they're not useful for or successful at pursuing, which would include, I think, much of macroeconomics for Hayek, unfortunately, modern macroeconomics. But the whole abuse of reason project, even though he never wrote those books, wrote that book the way he intended, the first volume, certainly much of many of his essays and his books in the 1950s onward period were about a skepticism about the power of reason and expertise, very much in what I see as the pragmatist school, not meaning practical, but in the common sense, but in the philosophical sense of being respectful of tradition and culture, even when reason seems to suggest it could be improved. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And indeed, my interest in Hayek, my earlier work before I was writing about Hayek was in a strange field called economic methodology, and it had to do with what does it mean to be a science, and is economics a science, and how do we talk about that? And it seemed to me that Hayek's basic insight, going way back to the 20s, so a lot of the way that my book Hayek's Challenge is structured is pursuing this theme through time, is about the limits of social science, what we can do as opposed to what we wish we could be able to do. So just that quote that you like so much from The Fatal Conceit is very much, I think, a central Hayekian insight. And he talked about scientism in the 40s, and he contrasted the social sciences with the natural sciences. I argue in my book that by the 50s, he was no longer drawing it as a contrast between natural and social sciences, but instead a contrast between sciences that study simple versus those that study complex orders and complex phenomena. And it's with the latter, of which economics was included. He said often, we can make pattern predictions, but we can't make specific predictions. We can't do any of the things that we would need to do if we were trying to intervene successfully in social phenomena. And that's a central insight, and I think it is a sobering one because it really does try to force people to think about what would we need to be able to know in order to accomplish this sort of change. Hayek said, you look at the world and you say, boy, it could be better. But he says, you have to really ask that question before you commit resources. And then, I have to finally add, it seems to me that the Hayekian and Austrian insights are very good here, but if you couple them with the kind of public choice insights about how actual decisions get made in government and the sorts of interests and the effects that they have on policies, it ends up making you really depressed about the prospects for successful government intervention, and I think this is what is the foundation for people who say, look, it's not so much I think government is necessarily malign. It's just it's so difficult to get it right. You don't have the knowledge, and you have interests that are having these effects. Maybe a smaller government will at least allow less of that kind of manipulation to occur.
And certainly, it's always worth mentioning that Hayek was not against planning. He was against central planning for most things, and he believed that the less there was of that, the more we could plan, which is where he thought the local knowledge was. And so it's just important to mention that.
The more the state plans, the more difficult planning is for individuals. This is one of his pithy statements from the Road to Serfdom.
And the other comment I'd make on the science debate is, to the extent economics is a science, it's more like biology than it's like physics. And we never ask biologists to do the things that we ask economists to do,
right.
Which is if we plant 17 more redwoods in this forest, how many, what's going to happen to the bird population in this corner? I mean, that's the kind of precision biologists don't pretend to have, and that's 90% of what the world asks of economists. And like Hayek, I think we should just say we can't do that. But it's hard, I guess, for some people to have those words come out of their mouth. Right. Let's talk about, we're out of time, so fairly briefly, what should people read to get started?
Sure. Use of Knowledge in Society is certainly one.
Which is available on our website at no charge, so we'll put a link up to that, as we often do. Individualism, True and False.
This is an essay that was published in 1945, I think, and actually published in 46. A lecture was delivered in 45. Lays out the contrast between the Scottish Enlightenment version of individualism that we've been discussing in terms of unintended consequences, and versus the kind of individualism that is atomistic, and in some ways you can view this as a criticism of socialism, but it also could be a criticism in some ways of the kind of ideas that underlie economic theory. Actually, this book, Individualism and Economic Order, contains a number of great essays. The Meaning of Competition is one where he says, anyone who's studied introductory microeconomics has learned about perfect competition and the assumptions that are made, and he says the worst thing you can do is to think that what you want to do is make the world look like that, because actually where real competition occurs is not in equilibrium. It's when you're out of equilibrium, and it's rivalrous competition. So those are three nice essays. Individualism, True and False has some political theory as well in it. Is kind of the movement from the road to serfdom to the Constitution of Liberty. You can view it as a step moving in that direction. And if you didn't want to read all of the road to serfdom, you could take a look at Freedom in the Economic System, which was his 1939 essay, in which he articulates some of the ideas that he develops more fully in the road to serfdom.
I would just add the Pretense of Knowledge, his Nobel Prize lecture,
which
lovely. I think is
You're
very
right. You're exactly
accessible,
right.
And has some of these ideas we've been talking about. And then in the books, what would you read?
Well,
all of them, of course. But.
Yeah. I would
is
say
there an order?
That
is there an order you'd recommend?
If you're a beginning person, you want to read The Road to Serfdom, just because it's so much in the news. But if you had more time, I'd say either the Constitution of Liberty or Law, Legislation, and Liberty. People who are sympathetic to the Austrian viewpoint really split over which one of those they prefer. So I'm not going to make a judgment on that. But either one of those would be something. And there are individual chapters within them that I think kind of get at the Hayekian ideas. Now, it's only if you're really have had a lot of coffee that you want to sit down and try to get through Prices in Production or the Pure Theory of Capital or the Sensory Order. I think monetary theory in the trade cycle is accessible to some extent, but less than the other things that I mentioned first. And as you said, the Federal Conceit is certainly readable, and it's short. So,
it makes me sad that most people say, who's this Hayek guy? I guess I'll read The Road to Serfdom, and many of you out there probably follow that path. I didn't find it a fraction as interesting as any of these essays or The Fatal Conceit or Law, Legislation, and Liberty or the Constitutional Liberty.
Yeah.
I think those are better places to start. So if you're out there listening...
Well, can I just second that in this way, too?
Yeah.
For articles, Hayek has to really hit the nail on the head. He has to say what he's going to say in a certain amount of space. Whereas with the books, I mean, he goes all over the place. He has lots of footnotes. It can be tedious. So I just want to second that if you get access to the articles, I think you're going to have a much richer experience, and you're going to get use of knowledge in society. I have yet to find a person who, reading that, didn't say, wow.
My guest today has been Bruce Caldwell. Bruce, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great again to be here. And send the scotch whenever you can, Russ.
Will do.
Okay.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.